Thank you all for joining the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia tonight. I'm Lauren Swartz, the President and CEO of the Council. We're an international affairs experience provider with over 70 years of expertise in connecting Philadelphia to the world. In addition to compelling and unique speaker programs like this one tonight, we provide world affairs education to over 2,500 middle and high school students across our region. We offer professional development on cultural diplomacy to business people and curate unique global travel opportunities worldwide. The Council creates civil discourse to better understand this very complex world around us. And we are committed to doing so in a non-partisan way, which I must admit is becoming a little bit more difficult in recent times. That doesn't mean that the Council shies away from difficult topics. It does mean that we seek voices and perspectives that help us rise above partisan divisions, which is why we are delighted to host Mr. Kevin Rudd tonight to unpack the challenging topic of China, and to do so from a global perspective born in Australia. Tonight's conversation offers a third-party view on one of the most impactful geopolitical relationships in the world. Before I introduce the guest, there are a few housekeeping, or should I say Zoom keeping items to share with our audience tonight. There's a digital program book for you, which you can access on our website or simply click on the link in the chat. There's biographies for our speaker and access and links to purchase this book and much more included there. Regarding format tonight, very shortly, Mr. Rudd will make opening remarks for us, and that will be followed by a brief moderated discussion between he and I. Then we invite you, our audience and members, to submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We'll get to as many of them as possible. As always, if you need any technical help, please drop a note into the chat and someone on our team will be right with you. And now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce our guest, Mr. Kevin Rudd. Mr. Rudd was the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, serving twice in that role from 2007 to 2010 and again in 2013. He served as Australia's foreign minister between 2010 and 2013 as well, and held a variety of other political leadership roles across Australia. And he has a lifelong focus on China, from his early studies at university, diplomatic posts, and he's a fluent Mandarin speaker. Mr. Rudd is one of the few world leaders who could go to China without relying on an interpreter to build relationships and understand what was going on around him. Currently, he serves as president and CEO of the Asia Society, which forges ever closer ties between Asia and the West through arts, education, policy, and business. Since 2015, Mr. Rudd has also been the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, a think and do tank dedicated to second-track diplomacy to assist governments and business on Asia policy. To share just a few more of Mr. Rudd's significant accomplishments, he expanded the East Asia Summit to include both the US and Russia. He ratified the Kyoto Protocol in 2007 and legislated for a 20% mandatory renewable energy target for Australia. He's a veteran on climate change issues, including working at the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Change Summit. He also doubled Australia's foreign aid budget, making Australia then one of the top 10 aid donors in the world. Mr. Rudd is also an accomplished author with many titles to his credit. Today, we're focusing on his latest book, The Avoidable War: The Dangers of Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. I highly recommend this as a read to understand geopolitical tensions from a non-American perspective in plain language, and from the view of someone who has studied the country for a lifetime and a former head of state. If you'd like to purchase a copy, there's a link to a local bookstore on our website for your convenience. Mr. Rudd will share his expertise tonight on US-China competition, specifically the concept of managed strategic competition. And we'll touch on Australia's role as well, and I'm sure take a trip around the world to help understand what we're talking about and everyone's position. Mr. Rudd, welcome, and I invite you to make your opening remarks, after which we'll have a brief discussion followed by audience Q&A. The floor is yours.
Well, good. Thank you very much, and greetings to all of our friends in Philadelphia. I've been privileged to visit the city of brotherly love on a number of occasions and spoken at the university. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about this book. I only intend to speak for 5 or 7 minutes about its overall structure and the argument contained within it. And then let's go to a more open discussion, as I think that's far more effective in responding to the questions which your audience have in the back or the front of their minds. So why this book? Probably 2 or 3 sets of arguments. The first is the reality for all of us who look carefully at this relationship, as I've done for the last 35 years, is that we are now in a state of strategic competition between China and the United States, whether we like it or not. And the competition exists for a purpose. It's about which country, the US or China, ends up being the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region and the dominant power globally in the 10, 20, maximum 30 years which lies ahead. And so whether people choose to recognize that fact in the language they use or simply look at the reality as it's unfolding on the ground, if it looks like competition, and smells like competition, and acts like competition, it probably is strategic competition. And by dominant power, I mean the dominant power economically, militarily, and technologically. And so the stakes, therefore, are very high. Second question I've posed is, should, therefore, this competition, this strategic competition, be unmanaged or managed? And if managed, then what is possible? I have a pretty old-fashioned view about unmanaged strategic competition. History is littered with the carcasses of nation states and political leaders who have believed that they can simply compete without any boundaries, without any rules of the road, without any guardrails to the overall nature of the contest with another country. And that is often and almost invariably ended up as crisis, escalation, conflict, and war. That's the nature of unmanaged strategic competition, of the type that we saw bubbling beneath the surface in June, July, and August of 1914. And the consequences for the international community and for the human family from that war were genuinely catastrophic. The alternative is to have some de minima guardrails, de minima guidelines, some de minima rules of the road, mutually agreed between both parties as to how to conduct this competitive relationship. Which brings me to my third and final point. What would it look like in practice? Or is it just some sort of fanciful, idealistic dream? My argument is that we should learn something from history, recent history. After the United States and the Soviet Union came close to blowing each other's brains out in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and half the rest of the world along with them, what happened in the latter 60s and the 70s is, in fact, the US and the Soviet Union did, over time, agree on certain de minima rules of the road. And despite the bitter ideological contest and political contest and diplomatic contest between those two great powers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we didn't get close again, really, to a fundamental crisis that would have resulted in direct military conflict between the two. There were plenty of proxy wars. There was plenty of pushing and shoving around the international community. But de facto, some rules of the road did emerge. So what might they look like in this case? I argue simply 3 elements. 1, on the core strategic red lines which dominate the US-China relationship, which are Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, and cyber and space. I believe it is useful for each side to develop its own set of red lines and to communicate those at the level of high-level private diplomacy with the other side so that no one's caught by surprise. Or if someone seeks to surprise, then it's quite plain that large-scale consequences would then ensue. But that is different from our current set of circumstances, which around each of those 5 sets of strategic red lines, The current rules of the road are simply push and shove and let's see what happens. That's dangerous. The second category within managed strategic competition is one whereby, given the first around strategic red lines, it's then, within this jointly agreed strategic framework, entirely possible for each side to engage in non-lethal but full-blown strategic competition with the other side in the rest of military policy, and military development, and the expansion of armed forces, because that's naturally what nation states seek to do to maximize their own security. Similarly, full competition in foreign policy, economic policy, trade, investment, technology, capital markets, currency markets, as well as talent markets. And on top of that, ideational competition in terms of the worldviews of each side, a Marxist-Leninist worldview dominated by Chinese power, or what we call the liberal international order, which is currently anchored in US strategic power. And the final element of this managed strategic competition paradigm is providing political space as well for those defined areas of continued strategic collaboration in areas where the common national interests of each side require that. And there the candidates, again, are relatively clear. Climate change action, because in the absence of global collaboration, unrestricted global warming by either the Chinese or by the United States has got enough to fry the other country, literally, over time. And secondly, other areas like global public health and the next pandemic, given how we botched up global collaboration on the last pandemic. And thirdly, continued global financial stability, given that both these countries represent the two largest financial systems in the world. And to conclude, this three-part managed strategic competition framework, what I call MSC, should have policemen within each of the senior diplomatic and military stabs of each relationship, led by the National Security Advisor in the United States case, Chinese equivalent Yang Jiechi in the Chinese case, perhaps backed up by the two vice chairs of the Central Military Commission in Beijing, to act as, frankly, the watchdogs, the enforcers, and the policemen of the relationship, because that is necessary in order to bring about stability. Does it remove all strategic risk? No, it's not a perfect solution. I'm into the practical business of how you reduce strategic risk, and most importantly, reduce the risk of what I still argue to be unavoidable war. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd. There's a lot in there that we can unpack together, and I look forward to doing so. I'll pick up on where you left off, recommending that once we establish this managed strategic structure, that we need people who will monitor it and hold ourselves and each other accountable. Is that realistic, do you think, on either side? Would the US and China's government each contribute, and continue to fund those resources?
It's not a question of funding the resources already exist. You're talking about the most senior diplomatic and military officials on each side, a handful in each case, who ultimately are the decision makers, and acting on behalf of their respective heads of government and heads of state. Is it feasible, though, to do that at a political level? I think it's possible, otherwise I wouldn't recommend it. And I do know that both in Beijing and in Washington, there is a search at the moment for a manageable strategic framework which could be jointly agreed, which would be able to bring about greater stability than is currently the case. It's a realist framework. It doesn't seek to wish the competitive pressures each side's exerting on this relationship, to wish those pressures away. That's fanciful stuff. But it is based on realpolitik, sort of thing we saw in the latter period of the US-Soviet relationship, where there were increasingly operational and originally de facto rules of the road. The scary thing about the US-China relationship right now is there are no real rules of the road, let alone any policemen. That's why I think it's in their mutual interest to do so.
So let's pick up. So if we had this framework in place and these monitors, these policemen of it, that might help bolster against changes in leadership. In the US, of course, changes in political trends and administrations, which are seeming to become ever more polarized, make it harder to carry out a long-term strategy that's as multi-leveled and multifaceted as this. Of course, in China, we have what feels like the opposite, a ruler for an undetermined amount of time, but for the rest of President Xi's life, which makes it harder, I think, in a way, at least for Americans to understand how we can keep this going. Can you talk a little bit about those different ways of approaching leadership and how that might contribute or provide solutions for this conflict? Xi being sort of president for life, we think that's the plan, that's his desire. Whereas America's political cycle looks ever more chaotic and unpredictable to people trying to work with us or against us.
Yeah, let me simply answer first from the American perspective. And look, I'm the former prime minister of a robust democracy like the American democracy, and I understand how electoral cycles work, and I understand how much political fisticuffs are involved in your average election fight. So I'm under no illusions about that. But secondly, it has always been thus in American politics. There was no halcyon day when suddenly all Americans put aside their foreign policy differences and said, you know, the other guy is right, I've been wrong all along. It's not been my experience and my read of American history, either since the Civil War, before the Civil War, or even the time of the American Revolution. In fact, the practical example I would put forward is this. When the United States under George Kennan seriously examined the nature of the post-war Soviet threat to the United States, and he recommended a strategy to the US administration under Harry S. Truman called containment. And I'm not recommending containment as it relates to China, but I'm giving you an indication of how things can be sustained over time. Containment remained the operational strategy of successive Democrat and Republican administrations. It was framed in 1947-48. It underpinned the American resolve in the Berlin airlift of 1948. It underpinned the American resolve in the Korean War of 1950. And it was sustained during Truman, during Eisenhower, during Kennedy, during Johnson, during Nixon, during Ford, during Carter, during Reagan, and during Bush Sr., when finally the Soviet Union fell. In other words, it was sustained from about 48 to 91 through multiple US presidential elections. So all I'm saying to my American audience is you guys are perfectly capable of doing this. You're going to have color and movement around the edges of it. That's called politics. But the substance of the operational doctrine, which was framed way back when against a realist analysis of the Soviet challenge in 46, 47, basically remained in place. And furthermore, the United States prevailed. As I said, the challenge for the future with China is different. I'm not recommending a replication of containment. And there's a reason for that. China, unlike the Soviet Union, represents the second largest economy in the world. The Soviet Union was not that big. Furthermore, the level of economic enmeshment between China and the United States stands in total contrast to the freestanding economic systems that existed between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the circumstances are different. But when a strategy is framed by the US administration, then it is capable of being sustained so long as there is a core group of Republicans and Democrats in the foreign policy and security policy establishment who can gravitate around it. So that's why I think it's practicable in the long term, not just within an electoral cycle.
I think a lot of Americans are wondering what is sustainable from administration to administration. And I'm certainly not asking you to comment on that, but that's the nature of our political environment right now that we're seeing.
But if we were sitting in
polarization
now, or the 60 election, or the 64 election, or the 68 election, or the 72 election, most Americans would have said back then, oh, I'm not sure we can ever agree on this. Mm-hmm. So all I'm saying is, there's never been a halcyon period of perfect bipartisanship. And I reflect on the Trump reality, that's a particular challenge because it was so beyond the normal parameters of, let's call it the centre-right, centre-left divide in the American political system. But I think because this is such a major fundamental challenge to the future of American power in the world, that it's not beyond the political establishment in DC to land on a position within parameters and have a debate within parameters, which is what occurred in the previous set of arrangements as it pertained to the then Soviet Union.
A time to look back on our history and remember that we can do this and we've done it before. So if we take it from the China side, how Xi-centric is the threat of conflict between the US and China with this particular leader at this particular moment in China on the world stage? How tied is the threat to this particular individual?
If you look at the growth of Chinese power and changes to the balance of power between the United States and China militarily and economically and technologically, it's been evolving, frankly, over the last 20, 25 years. I remember when I first went to work in our embassy in Beijing back in the Mesolithic period, back then the Chinese economy was about the same size as the Australian economy. There's been a lot of change since then. So if you like, that trend line has been there for a long time. But what has changed is the trajectory of the articulation of China's growing power under Xi Jinping compared with his most recent post-Mao predecessors. If I was to sketch this out in a visual way, the level of assertiveness between China and the United States has kind of gone by China towards the United States and towards American allies. It's kind of gone like that, growing slowly, and then under Xi Jinping, it went like that. So, the power increase was going like this, if you like. So that's where, if you like, the leadership dynamic of Xi Jinping enters into the equation. So if Xi Jinping is reappointed at the 20th Party Congress in November this year, which on balance he's likely to, despite the fact that there are many headwinds against him in Chinese domestic politics at present, if he is reappointed and he's there for the next 5 years, it's likely we're going to see that sharpened trajectory deployed against the United States and its allies right through until, frankly, 2035. And what concerns me, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that's precisely the time frame in which I think, all other factors being equal, Xi Jinping would wish to make a military move against Taiwan.
So you brought it up. Let's talk about Taiwan. And you mentioned of course, this framework that we need to help set down the rules of the road, the rules of engagement, where the red lines are. Of course, there's a lot of speculation, more than ever in recent times in the media here, questioning, is Taiwan really a red line, particularly on the heels of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, what we're witnessing happen with Russia and Europe and Ukraine? Talk to us about your view on Taiwan and whether and how it is a red line for the United States and for China.
One of the great dangers, I think, in the way in which Beijing analyzes the United States, and I base this on my reading of Chinese ideological documents and the discourse within China itself about the United States, not what the foreign ministry says on a day-to-day basis, is that the overall Chinese narrative now for the last 5 to 10 years, in varying shades of grey, has been the rise of the East and the decline of the West, has been about these emerging superiorities of the Chinese authoritarian capitalist system against the American liberal democratic capitalist system, most spectacularly evidenced by the American domestic management of the COVID crisis and that of the other democratic capitalist allies as well. And there's a general narrative which the Chinese have building on that, is that the United States is increasingly politically divided, incapable of maintaining a bipartisan national security policy, going back to the point that you made before. And on top of that, again, is an unreliable actor, as evidenced by a combination of Afghanistan, and the bulk of the propaganda at the moment used by China and Asia is Forget the detail about Ukraine, look at the actual fundamental reality here, which is the United States did not come militarily to the defense of Ukraine against the Russian Federation, and given that Russia in particular was a nuclear power. So that's the Chinese, as it were, worldview applied to Uncle Sam at present. The danger is that the Chinese therefore assume on balance is that the United States may well not act militarily if the balloon went up on the Taiwan question, say in 2029, 2030, when the Chinese would calculate that the balance of power would be even more advantageous for itself militarily, and furthermore that financially it would be more equipped to withstand any damage in terms of primary or secondary financial sanctions. But here's the danger. If the United States did not act militarily under those circumstances, then at that point, most American allies in Asia and Europe would regard that as the signal point that the United States was no longer itself reliable for any of its allied security arrangements. And its mutual defense pacts, if you like, and mutual security obligations with its 46 treaty partners around the world. So therefore, it's not just an intrinsic decision about Taiwan. This one would really matter. You see, Ukraine, at the end of the day, was not a treaty ally of the United States. Afghanistan was its own, as it were, unique case, but not technically a treaty ally either. In the case of Taiwan, yes, it's not a formal treaty ally, but the operation of the Taiwan Relations Act over such a long period of time has assumed a particular status in the relationship. So my overall argument is, on the balance of probabilities, the United States is on balance more probable to act in defense of Taiwan than is not the case. And secondly, the danger lies in the Chinese assumption that the US would not do so. That actually is a problem in terms of strategic stability.
So would you venture a recommendation to the US to make their Taiwan policy much more clear? Is that one of the red lines that the US should lay down in the sand so that China knows what the US will do and the rest of the world and our 46 treaty partners will see that?
My on balance argument on that, and I've seen people like Mike Pompeo and Richard Haas of the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, where I live, work, and have my being, ask or pose those as alternative futures for US security policy on Taiwan. Mm-hmm. I'm not an American, so I'm very conscious that I shouldn't be in the business of meddling, but let me go ahead and meddle because I'm an Australian and probably your oldest treaty ally, the truth be known, together with the Brits. The reason I would argue for the continuation of strategic ambiguity as the declaratory policy of the United States on Taiwan is because if you removed ambiguity, it unleashes a whole new factor in Taiwanese domestic politics, which may encourage levels of political irresponsibility on the part of political parties in the Taiwan democratic process, moving towards a unilateral declaration of independence from the PRC, which of course crosses a Chinese strategic red line. If the Taiwanese political process assumes that Uncle Sam is neatly tied down with a formal, unambiguous security guarantee to the Taiwanese, then it's kind of, I don't know if you have this expression in American English, but look, Mum, no hands as I'm riding the bicycle. Yeah. And sometimes you crash when that happens. I think a better approach is to sustain the formality of strategic ambiguity for those reasons. It sends a very big warning to Taiwanese domestic politics that they've got to take their own national defense seriously. They've got to take their own political responsibilities seriously, not to use extravagant language. And finally, part of the reason I've argued for this macro management concept of managed strategic competition is to prevent crisis, conflict, and war for the 2020s arising from, frankly, incidents and accidents, particularly when you have such a raw political and diplomatic relationship between Washington and Beijing. Things can catch fire very quickly. and particularly when you've got compounding nationalist forces now alive in China itself. But correctly, people will then say, well, aren't you just kicking the can down the road? So let me anticipate that argument by moving forward and saying, one of the reasons why managed strategic competition should be appealing to the United States is simply because it provides the US and Taiwan with the capacity to maximize their own military deterrence against China in the decade ahead. That means changing the force structure of what the United States currently has on offer in East Asia and the West Pacific. And I noticed the Indo-Pacific Command has been moving in that direction the last couple of years, but they need more time. And the Taiwanese have at last got the message that they need to begin to invest large scale in the sort of asymmetric warfare capabilities that you've seen at play on the battlefields of Ukraine, as the Ukrainians have fought a valiant and effective action against the Russian invading force so far. And both those force structure changes then enable you to have more of a deterrent effect, causing the Chinese leadership, when they turn to their military advisors in 2030 to say, well, comrades, can we do this? Can we pull it off? And they'll say, well, comrade Xi Jinping, I'm not so sure. I mean, these crazy Americans and the crazy Taiwanese have done other things in the meantime. Let me just conclude by saying what's the counter argument to that, which is the Chinese then say, well, we better get in ahead of that curve. If this is what the Americans and the Taiwanese are doing, then hadn't we be better preempted ourselves, bringing forward our natural timetable for military action? And I suppose my argument as to why China on balance would be less likely to do that is that right now, for a whole bunch of domestic political and economic reasons, the Chinese economy remains vulnerable to the US dollar-denominated international financial system, as well as SWIFT, and that is the foreign exchange settlement system, to the point that the economy would be wounded badly by the imposition of primary and secondary sanctions. And that's going to be the case for quite a number of years to come. So I think of all the options on the table, I think it's the aggregation of the elements of the logic I've just put forward, which I think is the best way to maximize stability in the Taiwan Straits, not just this decade, but into the following decade as well.
Thank you. We've got quite a few audience questions coming in, so we'll switch gears and open up the floor. As is customary here at the council, when we've got a young person passionate about these topics, we give them the floor first. We have a junior from St. Joseph's University here in Philadelphia, an international relations major, who we hope will be around a long time to solve some of these complex issues. Patrick, I know you're taking notes. The floor is yours to ask Mr. Rudd a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rudd. I'd like to thank you for coming on here and giving us a bit of an insight on a topic that you clearly know a great deal about. So I really appreciate it. One question I do have is, it actually pertains to reports that have been coming out in recent years as well as recent months about heavy military buildup by the Chinese in the South China Sea. So obviously that shows their ambition to exert influence in the region to kind of push the United States out. So I was wondering, how do you think that has affected the urgency of diplomatic discussions between countries like Australia and the United States, at least from a strategic perspective, as it pertains to potential aggression by the Chinese in the South China Sea?
Well, Patrick, and greetings to all of our friends at St. Joseph's University. By the way, I attended very briefly St. Joseph's Convent School in my hometown in Queensland in Australia. I would argue in response to your question, Patrick, a couple of things. The first is, as someone who's been a student of Chinese power for most of my adult life, the Chinese political establishment and military establishment have a very unsentimental view about power, which is you either got it or you haven't. And if you've got it, then use it if there's no risk of you losing on the way through. Therefore, the essential question about the future of the South China Sea, the competing territorial claims, is the perceived relative balance of power within that sub-region of the South China Sea between US forces those of its treaty allies, including the Philippines, and that'll depend very much on the nature of the outcome of the upcoming Philippines presidential elections as well, together with other treaty allies like Japan, Australia, etc. Because again, the ultimate decision in China's mind about how far to push in asserting its territorial and maritime claims will be determined by that. I think secondly, in terms of the diplomacy and the diplomatic collaboration around such scenarios, one of the consequences of China becoming more assertive under Xi Jinping has been the creation of reactive military collaborations or strategic collaborations across the region, like the Quad, bringing together Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, and most recently AUKUS, the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. And de facto, what is happening, therefore, is that these entities, these groups of nations, are now collaborating in a way in which they never did before around these scenarios. It's a funny old thing in global politics, a bit like domestic politics. Action gives rise to reaction. And what we're seeing, therefore, as a consequence of the assertion of Chinese power under Xi Jinping, are a series of regional reactions. But diplomatic reactions don't add up to a jot unless they're backed up by an underlying balance of military power. But thanks for the question.
Very good, thank you. We've got a question online from Lawrence Goldberg. He asks a very timely question about Russia. How firm, in your view, Mr. Rudd, is the alliance between Russia and China?
I believe it's much more robust than many in the traditional American commentariat have given credence to. And that's because of underlying Chinese geostrategic interests in a benign relationship with Moscow. Remember, the underpinning logic of the US-China relationship between, frankly, 1959 and 1989 was a common adversary in the Soviet Union. This became much more acute by the time you got to 69, and the outbreak of actual border fighting between China and Russia, which many people have forgotten, but the Chinese haven't, and certainly the Russians haven't. So from Chinese overall point of view, having that as a benign relationship releases all of China's strategic energies to be directed against their principal regional and global adversary, and that's namely the United States. And on top of that, is part of a de facto alliance with the Russian Federation. Russia, as a permanent strategic distraction to the United States and other theatres, whether it's Syria, whether it's Libya, or whether it's now the Ukraine, from China's global strategic competition with the United States perspective, that actually adds to overall Chinese strategic leverage with Washington. So for those reasons, it's strong. And anyone who therefore has concluded that Xi Jinping was on the cusp of moving in as a white knight to do a diplomatic negotiation, to mediate the end of the conflict and get Putin to go back to the Russian border and withdraw his forces, I don't think really understands the nature of the dynamic, the nature of the strategic dynamic underpinning the Putin-Xi Jinping relationship. And on top of that, there's a bit of what I describe as a political bromance going on there as well. Because if you talk to officials who have been with these two leaders when they meet, a large part of their conversation is about their common detestation of the United States, what it stands for in the liberal international order, and their common fear of domestic color revolutions within their own countries. So for those reasons, it's much more robust than I think people unfamiliar with the history would necessarily conclude.
In what ways is China potentially benefiting from or learning from Russia's invasion of Ukraine? What are the pieces of this unfolding war that China is gaining the most insight from for their own position?
Well, in aggregate benefit, number one is this makes Russia more dependent on China than even before. Mm-hmm. And against the logic that we were discussing just a minute ago, this is not just a benign relationship between Moscow and Beijing. It's what Beijing ultimately seeks with all of its 14 land neighbours, and that is a benign and compliant relationship with those land neighbours and the Middle Kingdom. I go to this in some length in the book that I have just released called The Avoidable War. I think the second factor from China's perspective in terms of what they observe in the field is that the Chinese Central Military Commission will be playing all the video reruns of every single military encounter in the field in order to make judgments for themselves. But the meta message will be this: if the Ruskies have run into such difficulty with a land-based invasion against a smaller neighbouring state, given the historical predominance of the old Red Army, for God's sake, we Chinese have got an amphibious operation against Taiwan in the future, which would be bigger in scale and magnitude than the D-Day landings. And therefore, under those circumstances, I think it helps inject a level of military caution on the part of Xi Jinping's military advisors. And the third learning, I think, is this. We touched on it before, which is the extent of financial exposure. That is, Russia, despite all of its best efforts, has had its foreign exchange reserves held in third countries frozen. It's been removed from the SWIFT system of international dollar-denominated financial settlements, and had a range of other financial sanctions imposed against various Russian individuals and corporations. So the Chinese, as I said, are as vulnerable now. But I do think what it does potentially is accelerate the Chinese timetable for floating the renminbi, liberalizing the Chinese capital account, in order to make the renminbi a much more traded and tradable international currency, in other words, a hard currency, and in order to increase the proportion of total global foreign reserves currently held in renminbi. At present, it's only 4% of global reserves, and so that China then becomes less vulnerable to what we've seen meted out already to the Russian Federation. I think there are three fairly big learnings, if you like, or impacts that come from this crisis.
And we certainly know China is watching and studying like the rest of the world. We've got a question from Andy Sabo. He asks whether you see the beginnings of the diminishing of China power. I asked this question based on the autocratic lifetime rule of Xi and domestic pushback, the inefficacy of the Chinese vaccine, the increasing questioning of the Chinese view of how the world works versus the liberal rule. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Rudd?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it's something which those of us in the analytical community need to take seriously. As your questioner would know, the danger of imposing linear projections for any country over time is that ultimately the line runs out. And the question in the analysis is when, and at what level of trajectory does it start to run out? Secondly, however, if we were to look at China's economic growth performance and military expansion funded by its growth performance over the last 30 years, it's been pretty linear. Okay, and the assumptions that I have heard in multiple subsequently released and declassified CIA analyses that the Chinese system was about to fall in a heap, was a debt trap waiting to explode, that it was this, that, and the other, frankly haven't come to pass. And we now have a highly formidable Chinese military. We also have the second largest economy in the world. And we have a country with $3 trillion, hard dollars, in foreign exchange reserves. So that's not bad in terms of being linear. Given that, as I said, when this process started, their economy was the same size as Australia's. It's now considerably bigger. But there are real headwinds. And for me, the number one headwind really requires sophisticated analysis. There's one I've been writing about now for the last 3 years, which is for Xi Jinping, for ideological reasons, has been rewriting the Chinese economic model. And he's doing so driven by ideology and pushing the center of gravity in Chinese economic policy further to the left away from the private sector, back towards the state sector, but more importantly, towards industrial policy, towards a self-sufficiency policy, and a new common prosperity agenda, all of which, when taken together, send signals to the Chinese private sector that this is a big change. Where do I put my money? Do I continue to invest in private fixed capital investment and expansion? Or do I find my Aunt Maymay's mattress and hide it under there instead? Now, there's a fair bit of that going on at the moment. So the question quantitatively, therefore, is, will this change in the growth model engineered by Xi over the last several years, largely for ideological reasons, ultimately bring about a quantum reduction in China's annual economic growth over time, and therefore mean that even if it does pass the United States economy in aggregate, it won't pass it by much. So that, I think, is the key variable. Apart from demography, another big driving force, aging population, declining marriage rate, huge declines in the birth rate. Therefore, you're going to have all sorts of impacts in terms of the labour market over time, together with, of course, the medium-term challenge of climate change, extreme weather events, national food sufficiency, etc. And for example, China had a very bad harvest this year, extreme weather events. We've seen some evidence of that in terms of food shortages in various parts of the country already. So the question's a good one, and I've outlined the variance we need to monitor for the period ahead to reach a judgment on it.
Thank you. All right, we've got a question from Arthur Cohn, harkening back to the Australian perspective as well. Arthur asks, should Australia and Japan go nuclear to hold China at bay?
Well, there's a good and non-controversial question. I would be reluctant to speak for Japan, but the driving politics that I observe in Japan have less to do with China on this question than they have to do with North Korea. And the thing we need to focus on most explicitly in terms of the Korean Peninsula is what Kim Jong-un is up to, not just in terms of his 12 to 13 missile tests in recent months, all in violation of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. But if I see, again, leaked US intelligence information at work pointing in the direction of a possible nuclear test, an underground nuclear test, you see that set of developments, the possible testing, full testing of an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, begins to create a series of circumstances in the Japanese body politic, which begin to ask this question: am I fully covered by the American nuclear umbrella, or am I not? And given that there is now this proximate danger with a formally declared, if it becomes that way, nuclear weapon state in North Korea, which has acquired its, as it were, Pakistan/India capability, that is an effective nationally controlled nuclear force to guarantee long-term, in their case, regime survival. What then does South Korea do, and what does Japan do? That's a very open debate at present, and is triggered by something I've collaborated with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs on, and Ivo Dalza, on the question of the future of American extended deterrence in Asia. On the Australia front, I don't see that as a real possibility. The political culture in Australia, which I've got some familiarity with, is not amenable to a discussion about Australia becoming a nuclear weapons state.
Raymond Termini asks us, is there a difference between strategic ambiguity and unpredictability? Where is the line there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is something which those in your intelligent audience may think about how this is best tested in game theory, because that's the best way in which you can actually tease out the difference. at least in terms of a desktop exercise, as to how ambiguity on the one hand plays out as opposed to unpredictability. Look, my argument is pretty basic in the absence of having conducted some elaborate game theory myself on this question. And I simply have spoken in this book as a practitioner, political practitioner leading a government, consuming intelligence product which is shared between the United States and its closest allies. So I've been in that position and I've observed how it works. I am, on balance, deeply concerned about a system which has, in the case of the Taiwanese, absolute certainty in the minds of the Democratic Progress Party, the pro-independence party on Taiwan, that they can do what they like on Taiwan's political status in the future, comforted by the fact that it's GIs who will be doing the fighting if it all goes radically wrong. I don't think that's saleable in American domestic politics either. I also think it's the wrong strategy. So therefore, I continue to support a strategic ambiguity for those purposes. On the flip side, however, on the broader question of the US-China relationship, I am concerned about simply leaving things to chance. And short of a formal military guarantee for the Taiwanese, if you went to my argument for managed strategic competition, within the whole basket of sub-issues on the Taiwan question, including what about the future of a naval blockade, an economic blockade by the Chinese around the island, the possibility of a cyber attack by the Chinese against critical civilian infrastructure in Taiwan, of China in the future seeking to salami slice Taiwan's offshore islands, some of which lie within just 10 kilometers of the Chinese coast. What does America do under those circumstances? These sorts of questions, I believe, should not simply be left to chance as we wake up one morning and say, oh, I wonder what we should do about that if it happens. I think we've got to the stage in this relationship between the United States and China that a level of high diplomacy, the Chinese should be left under no illusions that if those sorts of red lines were crossed, then consequences unspecified would flow in order to deter. And deterrence is actually the name of the game here.
So borrowing from this concept of maybe not just having the biggest guns and the most clear rules, right? There's lots of channels of diplomacy between countries, people to people diplomacy, arts, culture, student exchange, research collaboration. And certainly as a result of COVID and also political landscapes shifting, many of these parallel tools in our toolbox, although they seem smaller, they have a lot of power, yet they've diminished in the past few years. Is when we look at the US-China relationship, how important are those non-government to government channels of communication, collaboration, and connectivity in preventing war?
I think they're all critical and should continue to be prosecuted. That's why I'm not an advocate of decoupling. If you want to produce a genuine crisis in the relationship, then accelerate decoupling. If you don't, then look, I can understand restrictions being placed both by the US and China around certain critical technologies. I can understand that from a national security perspective. I participated in decision-making processes along those lines in my own country. But if you're just going to decouple everything, including the economic relationship and the people-to-people relationship, the academic collaborations, for example, how many Chinese students are at University of Philadelphia? I mean, then I think we begin to end up in a very brittle relationship. There's a second reason, though, to keep the other doors open, is that there is a capacity that if we navigate effectively through something like managed strategic competition for the decade ahead, if we manage through effective American and Taiwanese deterrence to cause the Chinese to think twice about launching a military attack on the island, then it's just possible that, quote, the ways of thinking about this relationship eventually change in Beijing and change possibly in unanticipated ways in Washington and in the United States, if there are alternative levels and lines of discourse which have continued to occur in the meantime. Now, that's not just fanciful stuff. And people say to me, well, why are you just kicking this stuff down the road in terms of managed strategic competition? Why don't we just bring it on now? I have a very old-fashioned response to that, which is, I really don't like war. I know it's unfashionable, but I really don't like it. Because guess what? If you lose it, the consequences are monumental, quite apart from the cost of war in itself. If America suddenly fought a war against China on Taiwan and lost, can you imagine the consequences for American regional and global power? Could you actually think that through? So people say you're kicking stuff down the road and waiting for other lines of problem solving and communication to produce different results. I would say unapologetically, yes, but not in some sort of peacenik sort of way, not some sort of kumbaya sort of way. My book is anchored in a very realist view of Chinese military power and the nature of the Marxist-Leninist system, what needs to be done in order to deter it from invading Taiwan, but on the meantime, minimizing the risk of conflict by accident.
Critical work indeed. Mr. Rudd, we should wrap up. I know you actually have a flight to get to. I'd like to thank our audience and our members for their really excellent questions tonight. I know many of them have read your book, and for those who haven't yet, again, you can click on the link on our website and order a copy from a local bookseller. I hope you all enjoyed the program and will consider joining us again. Next week on the 16th, we're having a conversation club on the topic of should museums return contested artifacts to their home countries. On May 11th, we're participating in Philly Tech Week to explore the question around tech's impact on human rights, a very timely discussion considering the human rights abuses and war crimes we're seeing unfolded in Ukraine and how technology is changing the game. On May 17th, we'll have our Diplo Chat series featuring Israel with the Consul General of Israel from New York, Asaf Zamir, joining us live in Philadelphia at the Suzanne Roberts Theater in Center City. Mr. Rudd, thank you again for your time tonight, your expertise, your leadership in Australia and far beyond. We truly appreciate you joining us. And for our guests, please remember that you can purchase a copy of his latest book on our website, The Avoidable War: The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. It truly is a practitioner's view. It's a wonderful read that is understandable and helps break down these complex issues from a third-party perspective, free from some of Americans' partisans politics, and with our friends from Australia helping us frame this critical question. With that, thank you again, Mr. Rudd.
Thank you, Lauren. All the best.
All the best. Good evening, everyone. Good night.